Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sayge Cafe, where we talk about all things witchcraft and witchcraft related. My name is Samantha, or as you might know me from social media, the Sage Witch. Today we are talking about gods, goddesses, and whether or not we should use them in our practices. So grab a cup, get cozy, and let's get started. For the most part, my practice is secular. And by that, I mean I don't work with any particular pantheon or even any at all. It is my belief that gods and goddesses exist in order to personify different aspects in nature to different cultures throughout time. If we look at different polytheistic pantheons throughout history, we will notice some similarities. Each pantheon has a god or goddess for things like love, abundance, protection, the harvest, and so on. While all these gods and goddesses might represent the same aspects, they are typically visually different from one another, based on the culture they originate from. Something else these gods and goddesses have in common are usually their stories to some degree. For example, the resurrection story has been shared by multiple gods throughout history, from Horus, Mithra, Attis, Krishna, to Jesus. Why do you suppose this myth is represented in so many different cultures? Because this and other stories are elements of nature. They are representative of the cycle of life, of birth, life, death, and rebirth. Many gods and goddesses share the same stories because they are representative of things like solstices, equinoxes, harvests, and times of rest. If you play video games, you might be familiar with the concept of reskinning. Reskinning is where a game developer will take the basic structure or image of a creature and do things like change the color of its skin, add or remove a few small details, or make them bigger or smaller. In a nutshell, humanity has been reskinning their gods throughout history. Some might think that this is a crude oversimplification and that there are too many differences between different gods and goddesses for that to be true. Those differences are typically cultural and are influenced by the type of land the people came from and colored by those people's customs. While we may not know their names, ancient peoples, well before written language was established, understood these forces in nature. They understood that in order for something to be created, there must be a balance of masculine and feminine energies. We see evidence of this through cave paintings of phallic images, of successful hunts, and we see this in statues and figures carved in the shape of voluptuous women. With all that being said, I'm not against having a dedicated pantheon that a person works with. The value of these gods and goddesses comes from what they represent. Oftentimes, what these gods and goddesses represent are very fine-tuned, well thought out archetypes and energies. For example, if you are seeking love, you might consider working with Aphrodite or Frigga, as both are considered goddesses of love. Both of those goddesses share the same core energy, however they are slightly different. While Aphrodite is more centered on beauty and love, Frigga was not only a goddess of love, but of magic and war. These slight differences are what make them valuable in our practices. It's important to do your research to discover the history and meaning behind these goddesses and gods before attempting to work with them. That being said, there are some practices throughout the world that are very adamant that their gods and goddesses only be used by those who have been taught the traditions of that practice by someone like an elder. More often than not, these are considered closed practices. And in order to learn them, you must study under someone like a high priest or priestess. It is important that if you do choose to work with a god or goddess or pantheon, that you do so respectfully and adhere to that culture's guidelines and traditions. I personally believe that skin color does not limit the relationship you can have with a certain god or goddess, as we are all children of the earth and stars. However, a closed tradition is a closed tradition, and if you want to learn about that tradition, it is important that you seek out a teacher. Many of these traditions are closed because followers were persecuted in the past for having practiced them. They are closed practices out of protection for the culture, the people, and the belief system. It is always important to be respectful and to be aware of this. Beyond that, feel free to research and learn about and possibly form a connection with a god or goddess that speaks to you. Archetypes do not have to be ancient to be valuable either. I have seen prayer candles featuring images of people such as Betty White, Prince, Mr. Rogers, Stevie Nicks, and so on. Many of these people are even still alive. The point of these candles, beyond something novel and comical, is that those people socially represent a certain energy or archetype of the time. When I think of Mr. Rogers, I think of kindness and compassion. When I think of Prince, I think of creative expression, sexual expression, and it balances both male and female energies. I'm not saying anyone should go out and worship Betty White as a goddess. What I am saying, though, is that these celebrities embody specific energies that we may want to cultivate in our lives. They give us a focal point and help us define our intentions further. And quite possibly, this theoretically could be how we got gods and goddesses in the first place. Perhaps someone long ago was inspired by a real person who embodied these qualities. And over time, they became clarified and a central focus of worship. While I do occasionally work with certain gods and goddesses, my practice is typically heavily inspired and focused on the elements. Aside from their physical representation, each element is its own archetype and holds different meanings and functions. I won't go into too much detail about these right now, as I intend on doing a podcast for each element in the future. When I do work with specific gods or goddesses, my personal preference is to work with those from the Norse pantheon, as those are the ones that I resonate with the most personally. In the end, whether or not you include gods, goddesses, or any kind of pantheon in your practice is entirely up to you. More often than not, the tradition that the witch follows will help determine what gods or goddesses to work with. However, if you don't subscribe to any specific tradition, the choice is entirely yours. I hope this finds you well. Don't forget to like and subscribe this video to keep updated on future videos. Be blessed, my friends.